Right, well, thank you, Owen, for that introduction, and I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak. When I was asked if I'd talk about the subject of impotence research and Viagra, and after some negotiation, we agreed that I would be happy to talk about that. I'll talk about Viagra, but I'll use this opportunity to talk about another one of my hobby horses, and that is the potential role of the ordinary NHS physician, like me, the jobbing consultant. I say physician because I happen to be one, but it applies to non-medical specialties as well. The importance of NHS consultants in research, and in particular, the importance of data collection. And this is very much a personal story. Of course, the reason I'm here is because of the play Men Up. I assume some of you have seen this. This was shown just after Christmas on the BBC, and I was very much involved in the production of this, because it's the story of how the first trials of Viagra were done in Morriston Hospital in the early 1990s. And I asked the producers not to use my real name, so the guy on the left is the guy who played me. His name is Dr. Dylan Pearce, played by the actor Aneurin Barnard, who I think you'll agree is far too good looking to play me. But apart from that, I thought he gave an excellent performance of the role of what happened that time during the early research into Viagra. And the story is basically true. I was approached by the scriptwriter, Matthew Barry, a long time ago, and he produced the script, he produced the script of the play, which is essentially correct. A key part of the story was the friendship that formed between the men who were taking part in the trial. Well, that didn't happen. That was artistic license, but I thought it worked. I thought it worked very well. But the rest of the story is essentially true, and I thought the play was excellent, and certainly the critics did. I think a bit of background is required. I was appointed as a consultant to Morriston Hospital in 1992. A few months later, I was approached by Pfizer by one of the newly appointed medical advisor, Mitra Budal, whom I happen to know quite well, asking if I'd be interested in doing some research into a new product they had called UK 92480 as a possible impotence treatment. Would I be interested? And the obvious question is, why me? You know, a newly appointed DGH physician, why are they coming to me? Why didn't they go to some established centre with a track record in this area? Well, the answer is simple: there weren't any. And it's certainly true to say I wrote a leading article in the BMJ in '93, and I described impotence as the most neglected complication of diabetes, which it was. It was completely ignored. It's ignored by the British Diabetic Association, as it was then, now Diabetes UK. So if you look at every single publication they produced for patients, completely neglected impotence. And the reason for that probably is the Masters and Johnson myth that impotence was psychogenic. And that's certainly when I was taught as a medical student. It's what in all the medical textbooks I had at the time. And then things changed when the few physical treatments came in the early 80s, namely self-injection treatment and vacuum devices, and they worked. So the penny dropped. So we had a problem that could be cured if you used a physical treatment, but only if you used it. So maybe the problem wasn't psychogenic, maybe it was physical. And this was taken forward by a few dedicated amateurs like myself and a few other people. My particular interest was the vacuum devices. And we published on this, and so we were 2 or 3 fish in a very small pond. At the same time, Pfizer were researching this drug, UK 92480, as a potential treatment of ischemic heart disease in their plant in Sandwich in Kent. And after these new drugs go through animal studies, they have to go out to the first trials in humans. And there are the companies that do this, and it's no coincidence they tend to be in areas of high unemployment because they can attract men as human guinea pigs who will do this study for the money. And the first trials were done in Merthyr Tydfil at one of these companies. So the Viagra story is entirely British, but it has a big Welsh element in it. And how good it was as a treatment for ischemic heart attack, we do not know, but it clearly became apparent that it had other effects, because many of the men refused to return the unused tablets because their sex lives had improved. And because of this, certain key individuals in Pfizer, most notably David Brown, persuaded the company to take this forward as potential treatment for impotence. And they are the real heroes of the story, not me, okay? And they approached myself and the guys in Bristol to do this first joint trial. In fact, we had just about finished before Bristol recruited their first patient. So we can claim to be the first people to have done this trial in impotence and diabetes. Okay, now the study we did was very much as outlined in the play. It was a two-part study. The first part was after taking a single dose of the tablet, it was placebo-controlled, either active drug or placebo, and the response was measured using a device called a Ritchie scanner attached to the man's penis while he watched pornographic videos. Okay? And of course, we had problems finding a place to do this research. Pfizer suggested we use our local private hospital, but that's the Sancta Maria, which was then run by nuns, so I didn't think that was a good idea. In the end, we had a recently vacated ward, which is perfect for the post. And I was lucky, the very first chap we gave it to, it was clearly active, not placebo, and it worked. And the results were dramatic. In the play, after the drug works, you see a song and dance routine, there's dancing in the streets. Well, we didn't have that, but it wasn't far short, because this chap had had his first erection in years, and it was very exciting. And then after that, there was the second open label part of the trial. They took the tablets home, and I had also had the experience of men refusing to return their unused tablets. And several of the men wrote letters of complaint when the trial was finished that they couldn't get access to this drug, which has changed their lives. The rest, as they say, is history. And looking around, I think probably only a few of you will be old enough to remember the massive media response to Viagra when it was launched. It was absolutely incredible. As well as the research arm, I also got involved with the marketing arm at Pfizer. And the marketing director was a man called Peter Smith. I got to know him very well. And he said, after the launch, he said, I think I've been contacted by every single media outlet and organization in the whole world. And he said, but I knew I was onto something different when I was contacted for an interview by Homes and Gardens magazine. So things had changed dramatically overnight. What had previously been the most neglected complication of diabetes was now almost like the number one news story in the whole world. And it had a massive publicity. And I was about the only person in the whole world who had any data on it. So I was invited to speak over the world, staying in the very best hotels, eating at Michelin-starred restaurants. It was wonderfully exciting. And if we're looking for reasons to do research, Michelin-starred restaurants, first-class travel, what other reason do we need? But more importantly for me, it was wonderful to being at the forefront of a new area, and it set me up, in my determination to do research. So this is a personal view, and I just retired. I was totting this up, and I produced 75 publications, 2 books, and 5 book chapters. Now, if there's any academics here, they would laugh at this. I think Steve Bain is in the audience. For him, this is a morning's work. But I was always a full-time NHS consultant with the same duties and on-call as the other consultants. And more importantly, as I retired, this has been the most rewarding and fun part of my job. And I cannot imagine having done it without this. So let's talk about research and the NHS physician. And I would suggest there are several categories here. One is major funded interventional research funded by organisations like the MRC or the Welsh Government. There's commercial research, funded by the pharmaceutical company. But what I really want to talk about is non-interventional, the sort of research that a DGH physician can do, which includes things like cohort studies, cross-sectional studies, case control studies. And the point I want to make repeatedly is the importance of data collection and the power of a good database. Swansea recently had its R&D day, and these are some of the studies presented. Look at the impressive lot. Ipilimumab in advanced melanoma, dexamethasone patients with COVID, stroke trials, cancer vaccines. These are all often multi-centre, important, properly funded studies. It's a reflection of the fact that Swansea is now a teaching centre. And can a DGH physician get involved in this? I think we have to be realistic. That to be involved in the DGH, it has to be done in collaboration with an established centre. But I would suggest a DGH physician has much to offer. They have the real-world experience. They have knowledge of unmet needs. And links with the DGH are much appreciated by the academic centres. Funding bodies often prefer it if the centres are multi-study and include DGHs. And for this, I would suggest a patient database is gold dust. And I honestly think Wales is well placed to deliver this, because it's a discrete population. We can make our own rules to a degree, and we have groupings within Wales. I can only talk about in diabetes endocrinology, which work very well. Commercial research funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Again, a DGH is unlikely to be approached to undertake major pharmaceutical research, but there are good reasons to get involved. And let's face it, industry makes major contributions to medicine, and it provides patients access to new treatments. Most importantly, I would suggest it's an important source of funding to fund other research and other things. And what you have to offer in a DGH is access to patients. I would say, however, a proper clinical research unit is essential. I don't mean a clinical trials unit. I just mean people. There's so much regulation now who know what to do and have the background to do this. When I did the Viagra trials at the start, we had a small clinical research unit, one full-time, two part-time people of nursing background, and I couldn't have done the studies without them. It's now expanded greatly, and if you don't have access to a clinical research unit, found your own. They're self-funding or even profit-making. This is what I want to talk about. Research you can do if you're not in an academic centre, especially if you have a database. And the power of the database is a key theme. Why do your own research? Well, it's fun, it's rewarding, you really get to know a subject like in no other way. And importantly, you can take forward your own ideas. And that's the crux of it, really. You can build links with other units and with other professions within your own unit, and it provides experience to trainees. And this is one of the most rewarding things I've done, is bringing trainee doctors into research. And maybe, just maybe, you can come up with some results that change practice and improve patient care. To illustrate this, to bring home to you how useful a database can be, I'll go back to a study I did when I was a senior registrar in Leicester. And Leicestershire was then the biggest health authority in the country, population just shy of 1 million, and usually had one diabetes service, adult and paediatric combined, that looked after all the diabetic kids. And my own old boss, John Hearnshaw, kept a paper-based register of all the diabetic kids over many years. And I learned from my wife. My wife, before she retired, was a community paediatrician. She told me that all the kids in Leicestershire had their heights measured routinely, and all these data were available. So this study was her idea. I thought it would be interesting to look at the height of kids who were later diagnosed as diabetic before they became diabetic. Now, would anyone like a guess as to what the results showed? Basically, diabetic kids become significantly taller than controls up to 3 years before diagnosis. Put your hands up if that's what you thought. It's an interesting observation. And what can you conclude from that? Well, I'm not sure, but perhaps it suggests that if we're going to look for the causes of type 1 diabetes, we need to go at least 3 years before diagnosis. And this study brought home to me the power of the database. And I took bits of paper, the handwritten diabetes register, to the school's health department and in about 3 or 4 afternoons downloaded all the information I wanted. So when I moved to Leicester, I was determined to collect data. And I was very lucky that I was able to acquire the Leicester Clinical Workstation, which is written by my old boss, Trevor Howlett, in Leicester. And the advantage, as well as being an IT boffin, he did the same job as me. He was a consultant with an interest in endocrinology. So his database was perfect. And this is the screen that we had. So every single patient, you'd enter the demographics would be uploaded from the PAS system, but the clinicians would enter basically the drugs and the diagnosis. And the key thing about this, and this is absolutely crucial, the data were coded. It was used reading the read codes, which are no longer supported. Now we tend to use SNOMED CT. But the way the data was entered was hierarchical. So if you weren't too sure what the code was, you'd enter thyroid disease, and you'd go more and more specific down to Graves' disease or whatever. And all the trainees who came into our department rapidly learned how to enter and code data using this. The biochemical results were uploaded automatically from the Path Lab computer. The height and weight and blood pressure were entered by the nursing staff, all this coded. The foot data was entered and coded by the podiatrists. And we got the results of the All Wales retinal screening program, and these data were entered by the medical secretaries. And all this data was uploaded automatically into the patient letters to the GP, and the GPs really appreciated this, because the patients would come up a week before their clinic appointment, and we'd have their biochemical results, and we could put it in the letter straight away that was sent to the GP. So the data we had on the database for the diabetics was diagnosis, medication, blood pressure, foot data, retinal screening, and biochemical data. And I can't tell you what a powerful tool this was for research and for audit. So if we'd entered a new drug, if we started using a new drug, 6 months, a year later, you could go back, and without accessing the notes, you could look at all the results of how this drug had impacted in terms of diabetic control or whatever. Okay? It was useful for identifying research, particularly commercial patients. And for this, it was very powerful indeed, because I was approached, for example, by a company wanting to do research for a new treatment for hypoparathyroidism, a rare condition. Immediately, I was able to tell them, yeah, I've got 27 patients with that. I was approached by a company to do a trial, which we didn't do, of yet another ACE inhibitor, but they wanted patients with a certain degree of renal dysfunction and a certain degree of proteinuria. And again, we could just enter the criteria and we'd tell them exactly the number of patients we had with those criteria. It was useful if a drug was withdrawn. You could, as several drugs like appetite suppressants have been, you could rapidly get a list of all your patients on that drug and be right to them within a few hours. I'd like just quickly to run through some examples of the sort of work we did and to show the importance of this. This was a study undertaken by the podiatrists, and this was a 4-year prospective cohort study looking at the risk factors of those who develop foot ulceration. No big surprises here, but the group with the lowest, the predetermined low risk, the incidence of foot ulceration was very low and increased as all the risk factors increased. And that was important because it enabled them to adjust their frequency of foot surveillance according to the risk. But more importantly for me, it got the podiatrists involved. So the podiatrists are the ones entering the data, and they were the ones who got their names on the paper. They went to the meetings in which the results were presented. They were part of the team. So when they entered the data, they knew it was something that they were involved in, and they were getting something back for that. This is another study done in conjunction with a SAIL database. This was looking at blood pressures, basically to answer the question, are something we suspect, are blood pressure readings in a diabetic clinic higher than in the community? And this was, if you're not familiar with the SAIL database, it's a big database in which the data are anonymized, but you can bring together patient data from different sources. And the key thing about this study was it was paired data. So you're comparing blood pressures within the same patient. And I don't think this has been done before. And the results showed, perhaps not unexpectedly, that blood pressure was consistently higher when measured in a diabetic clinic. It's another study done by Jenny Hayes. This is part of her MD thesis, basically looking at risk factor ulceration. And this particular one was addressing the question, is social deprivation, associated with lower limb amputation? Prospective study, again, a big cohort, and you can get a marker of social status from this the postcode, which she did. And again, this was just done using data downloaded from the database. And basically, social deprivation doubles your risk of amputation. Endocrinology. I was approached by my then F1, Vicky Wilson, said, have you got any ideas for audit or research? I said, well, as it happens, I do. And by this stage, I had something like 600 pituitary patients on the database and maybe 200 patients with hypopituitarism, pituitary dysfunction. And a lot of them, there was no obvious cause. So I said to her, why don't you look at all the patients who have a normal pituitary on imaging and find out what the causes are, which she did. And the bottom line is, sorry, let's go back. If you have someone whose pituitary is normal on CT or MRI and they're hypopit, think of hemochromatosis and sarcoidosis, okay? Which is a worthwhile learning point. I've not seen it in print before. Admittedly, in a very small, specialized area of medicine. The important thing to me was we got an F1 doctor involved. She did the research, she submitted the paper, just corresponded with the editor about the referee's comments. She presented the results at a meeting. And this is invaluable research, invaluable sort of experience for an F1. It was a line on her CV, okay, it was only Quarterly Journal of Medicine, it's not the New England Journal, but for her it was important. And this is one of the most rewarding things about research is bringing trainee doctors in and giving them that kind of experience. This, I'm particularly pleased to be associated with. This was actually done in Leicestershire. I was involved in this study, and my colleagues in Leicestershire, Trevor Howlett and Miles Levy, use exactly the same database I've got, and they looked at the long-term outcomes of thyrotoxicosis in patients with treated with anti-thyroid drugs. Now, this is another hobby horse of mine. I've been a long-term advocate in Graves' disease of anti-thyroid drugs, and we've been battling the massive sort of organization in British endocrinology, which supports ablative treatments such as radioiodine. And amazingly, until then, there had been virtually nothing published on long-term continuous anti-thyroid drugs, mainly carbimazole. And this was the outcome, basically. It was about 5,000 patients, big study, of which maybe 1,000 had long-term carbimazole, 15 years follow-up, and guess what? Long-term anti-thyroid drugs are every bit as effective as ablative treatments in maintaining euthyroidism. And most importantly, there were no serious side effects, not one case of the dreaded agranulocytosis. So, in summary then, I would suggest an NHS DGH physician can undertake research in various forms. Major funded interventional research is important and we should get involved, but it really has to be done in collaboration with a major centre. But from the DGH, you can make major contributions, and I honestly think Wales is well placed, or should be well placed, to do this. Commercial research is also important. DGHs can make an important contribution again. It's all about access to patients. It's very important for raising funding for other research and other things. I would strongly suggest that some sort of research unit with appropriately qualified staff is essential, but a database in this is gold dust. And finally, most importantly, physician-led research. The main thing about this is you can take forward your own ideas. okay? But you must acknowledge your limitations. And then once again, yet again, it's all about having the data. An interrogatable database is a very powerful tool. Now, I realize primary care has been ahead of hospital service for many years, and those of you here who come from primary care may be feeling a bit smug at this, that you've had databases for a long time. But the fact of the matter is, I've just retired, and I had the only interrogatable database in Swansea Bay, and I certainly had the only one in diabetes endocrinology in Wales. Coded data is infinitely more useful than uncoded data. And it's invaluable for researching specific outcomes, complications, treatments. Data entered by the clinician is best. I think we'd all agree data entered by a clinician is better than data entered by a clerk. But it's best if it's entered by someone who's getting something out of it, who's getting something in return. And on this, big top-down systems, you know, have certain disadvantages. The database I described is no longer available in Swansea for a couple of reasons. One, the recodes aren't supported anymore, and two, it's 32-bit, Windows has gone to 64-bit. I have no idea what that means, but it means the database doesn't work anymore. And it's been replaced in Wales in diabetes by the Wisdom system, which, guess what, does not allow any local interrogation. So all the research I described to you is no longer available. It's all going to stop. We are told in part because of GDPR issues. Now, I've deliberately not got into that, but I strongly believe that this sort of research and data is so important that we need to address this and do whatever's necessary with all the necessary safeguards so that we can access local research data locally. So why do research? It's fun and rewarding. You really get to know your subject. It changes going to meetings. We all have to go to meetings. If you're going there as someone who's presenting something, it's much more fun than going as someone who's just, a delegate. It provides fantastic experience for trainees. It lets you build up links with other units, other professions, podiatrists, specialist nurses, and most importantly, it's important you get them to do most of the work. Why do research? Well, sometimes also it produces results which change practice and may be of benefit to patients. And if you're very lucky, you might get a TV movie made for you, about you. Okay, thank you.